behalf of Broadband.money and the broadband grants community, so excited to welcome Ernesto Falcon for an hour of Ask Me Anything, right? Or Ask Ernesto Anything. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity because even though, we've interacted, I've seen his name in many of these circles, we haven't really talked a lot. So when I had a brief chance to catch up with him and learn a little bit about EFF's role in broadband access, the broadband space, and particularly open access, which I hope we'll be talking a little bit about, I was just really impressed. And please, read the short profile of Ernesto. But most importantly, put your questions forward. We got about more than a dozen. We'll be working through those. But Ernesto, welcome. Kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what first took you to Washington some years ago.
Yeah, I originally I was not super political growing up, and towards the end of college, I that just kind of got the political bug. A lot of it was a kind of highly contentious time. We had the second war in Iraq, and I graduated college right when that was kind of at the apex politically, and wanted to get involved. This was it's funny because this is at a time early in kind of computer technology. Broadband was still fairly new. I got to interact with my first cable modem in college. So super interested in the technology stuff. I didn't know you can make a living out of it in terms of working in this space and working in, as a lawyer in this space, because it wasn't really that fleshed out of a field. It was just kind of still in its early days. So yeah, ended up going to a campaign and then ended up in DC afterwards for a handful of years working in the House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm. So what was it like? Where did you get techified? Right? I mean, like in growing up in high school, grade school. I mean, college. What kind of first prompted you to hey, this is really important. This future of the internet thing.
Yeah, for me, I remember the world before kind of the commercialization of the internet. I'm not. It's not that long ago still.
Right.
And I remember the advent of dial-up, and you had to pay per minute to use the internet, and email, being like the newest coolest thing. So I grew up with this stuff, and I got to see so many leapfrogs of technology, through grade school, through high school, through into college and beyond. And I've always been a fan of tech and playing with devices. I'm a gamer. I got a bunch of friends that I game with still today. And we kind of grew up with this stuff. And the internet was such a powerful force. I mean, in the early years, the tech industry, you would find something new and cool pretty much every few months, and something revolutionary would be coming every 6 months. And it's just really an enormous amount of rapid change that was enabled by being able to access the technology. And so, I guess that developed my advocacy in figuring out how to get this to everyone and figuring out how to make it accessible to everyone, even if you don't have financial means to access to get. So a lot of it stems from the fact that I grew up benefiting from it, and I think I think everyone should.
Yeah. Did you kind of come when you worked for Representative Blumenauer of Oregon and then Bart Stupak of Michigan? Did you kind of focus on tech, or is that what you gravitated towards? And tell us just a little bit about what you learned that you didn't know before working at a House committee on telecommunications and the internet.
Yeah, so it's a fun story because it's so I've always had this natural affinity to technology, just as a fan of it. And I still didn't quite know how you could make a living working in that space. It was other than being like a pure engineer or someone
Right.
who works for a company. And the issue of net neutrality came to Congress kind of in full force around 2000. I mean, it's always been around, but in terms of the legislative debate, at least my time there, it was around 2004, 2005. When Ed Whitaker, the CEO of AT&T, at I think it was a NARUC convention of sorts, basically told folks, "Hey, we're gonna have to figure this out. No one rides over these pipes for free." And as I mentioned earlier, my generation grew up with all these amazing things happening because, quote unquote, they rode over the pipes for free. They don't really ride for free, but the internet as it existed was dynamic ever changing, amazing. We didn't even have social media yet. Social media came maybe another year or two after I was working at that time. But the potential what could come was well recognized by many, many people in the policymaking space and many of the advocates. And so that is what started me to really hone in on where does this issue of net neutrality and just internet access, where does that reside here in the institution? And that's where I led to my second job with Bart Stupak from Michigan, retired member at this point, but he worked on the Energy and Commerce Committee on the subcommittee of telecommunications. At the time, they're called the Telecommunications of the Internet. And that's where net neutrality starts. And so I really wanted to be front and center on staffing that issue on the next go around.
Right, right. Now, I remember well the telecom bill, the Telecom Act of 2006, right? The 10-year anniversary of the and it was going to be a big bill, and it got
the COPE Act. Yep.
Say that again.
The COPE Act was the short of it. The competitive online protection. Someone, I forget the acronym, but COPE was the short term. Yeah.
Well, it got far, but not far enough. And I remember like a dramatic Senate hearing. This is the one where Ted Stevens said, it's like these series of tubes, right?
Yeah. Well, and so and I got fun connections to that story. My future coworker. So when I left the Hill, I went to a nonprofit called Public Knowledge, and my coworker Alex Curtis was the person who recorded Ted Stevens doing that, and then it was like, this is gold. Like, we got to put this out on the internet, and had no idea like what that would spiral into in terms of the internet. The internet's full of the tubes and all that kind of stuff. So it was good.
Yeah, no, that was a meme-worthy moment before memes were big. Yeah. But okay, so you said a public advocacy, what do you call it? A nonprofit group called Public Knowledge. Yes, of course, Public Knowledge is the amazing, legendary nonprofit founded by Gigi Sohn. Okay, so now did you work with Gigi? Tell us a little bit about Public Knowledge at that time, and like, was there still a kind of the same feel or a different feel towards the internet as you think we have today?
So Gigi Sohn actually hired me so as I mentioned earlier, my second boss retired. I believe that was in 2010. So I was, going to be out of the job by the end of the year, and had to figure out what I wanted to do next. Cared a lot about the internet, cared a lot about broadband policy, wanted to keep working in that space, but was ready to see what work off the Hill or outside the Hill was going to be like. And a mutual friend of ours introduced Gigi Sohn and myself, and we hit it off. I interviewed with the rest of the Public Knowledge staff, and it's still like there's still the same organization. It's still the same organization dedicated towards competition, openness of the internet. Still work in a lot of kind of intellectual property, freedom to use intellectual property works, and kind of the term public knowledge is about the transition of copyrighted works into the public domain, and like the value of expanding our access to knowledge and culture that's meant to be free at some point. It's still the same organization. And, now the issues have changed. I think the tech industry at that time was much smaller, was really really under the thumb of many existing legacy incumbents who were trying to snuff them out or take over like where the things were going in terms of the markets. And you fast forward today, now they are the market. I mean, the tech industry is massive, right? They're $1 trillion corporations, and a lot of the emphasis, including EFF and Public Knowledge, is now thinking about antitrust and to get back to the internet world that we're familiar with, many of us from our generation, of robust competition, the garage startup, the world where the best idea works its way to the top, becomes viral, becomes the next big thing on the internet. A lot of that has been, we'd argue, suppressed because of the amount of dominance and mergers and acquisitions and things that are used to kind of eat up the good idea or snuff it out before it disrupts an existing player.
But do you agree with that, Ernesto? I mean, what's your take on is Google and Facebook and Amazon and who's the other one? Apple. I mean, are they like the octopus, like the anti-Rockefeller, the trust busters that they talked about, the octopus, right? I mean, are they like that, or are they not like that? Are they just big successful companies? What's your take on it? Or, this is Ask Me Anything, so I got to ask you this.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think there is real challenge of the amount of concentration that's happened in industry. And we work on all fronts. We work on the access front because there's lots of monopolization in terms of broadband access. And we work on tech industry issues in terms of kind of modernizing antitrust law. I mean, the challenge here is the reason why they're big, right? The reason why they're as you call like the octopus is vertical integration. They have so if markets are direct competitors or quote unquote horizontal, and then if they're kind of distributors and suppliers and kind of down a chain, that's vertical. So all of the tech companies are kind of a whole suite of services that are not actually directly in competition with one another, but are all kind of intertwined with the market and like how the economy works. And our antitrust laws have been designed over decades, through what's called the Chicago School of Thought here. Vertical integration is good, and horizontal horizontal competition is preferred, and it's kind of missed the ball. It's missed the ball on what was happening in tech. And so yeah, no, we've supported a number of bills that would kind of change the standard of assessing competition. Another piece actually, as I mentioned, that a lot of our old way of thinking about things is would prices go up or down with the following transaction or merger. But as you know, everything on the internet is technically free. It's free in terms of the access to the service, but not really free in terms of like how they monetize it, the billions of dollars that are made from advertising and harvesting your data and then packaging it and all that. So a methodology of assessing the danger to competition based on like our prices going up or down is kind of ill suited for a world that's really monetized on personal data
Right.
and geolocation, things like that. The chair of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan, wrote an excellent paper on kind of the rethinking of antitrust, and I think we definitely fall along a line with that, kind of the rethinking of how we do this.
All right. Well, interesting foreshadowing of one issue I certainly want us to talk about in terms of telecom and competition in the telecom markets. But getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves. So you basically decided that you wanted to become a lawyer while you were working in this field, and you went to law school. Tell us just a little bit about the law and how the law interacts with the telecom industry, and your particular story as part of that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. A lot of people don't realize the extent regulation and law creates markets, or prevents markets from emerging in this space. There is an inseparable connection between government policy and the status of our broadband connection and the status of our wireless connection in terms of so wireline or wireless. The phones here are highly regulated in lots of different ways. Most notably from the government, like for the Federal Communications Commission, the wireless licenses that are distributed or allowed to be used for certain uses. This is why FM radio works. This is why TV broadcast works. This is why satellites work. And all of these have to be kind of refereed by government policy. And so for me, probably the biggest thing I wanted to get out of going to law school and becoming a lawyer is really sharpening up my work in administrative law. Administrative law is essentially the law of the regulators. The rules regulators have to follow in order to create, interpret statutes, and issue new regulations or change, change regulations, or in some cases, the need to prevent a regulator from overstepping their authority in, in issuing a new direction or new guidance for matter of, an agenda that may exist but may not be supported by the laws that exist.
Right, right. So after you finished law school, you've worked in California, right? So what have you like left Washington behind, right? I mean, what's your take on whether policy around broadband and the internet is best accomplished in DC or outside of DC?
I guess I'd have to say both. I still work both areas. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation has me do legislative work in Washington D.C. and I also do legislative work in Sacramento and in the other 49 states. But we do a lot of work in California just by proximity. We're based in San Francisco, so it's easy for us to get to the capital here in the state. But I've been up to Oregon. I've talked to folks in New Jersey, and kind of a number of other states. So, I guess you have to kind of divide it up on where the issue is that you're trying to address. So federally, wireless policy is really federal domain. The FCC is the entity that decides how licenses are issued in terms of spectrum, and that literally will create markets or destroy markets. We have Wi-Fi because the FCC made a decision to enable what's called unlicensed spectrum, for example, right? The entire wireless industry that is based on Wi-Fi, 5.0 and 2.8, if I remember the numbers right. It's all premised on a regulator deciding we're going to allow anyone to use this spectrum. They have to follow certain power guidance rules in terms of the devices, but it's kind of a free for all for how you want to do it, so long as you follow these like base minimum rules. And at the time when they issued that guidance for wireless spectrum for that slice of it, they had no idea what it would create. But now like everything's dependent on that. So the federal side, particularly on the wireless side, is really kind of integral. But then when you get really down to it, building these networks is a very local issue, right down to the cities. Not so much, and there's kind of depends on the state. Some states have a lot more state control over how infrastructure planning works, and a lot of states have very localized control where the cities themselves are the kind of the kings and queens of deciding how the wires are laid.
Are we going to talk about Dillon's rule, Ernesto?
Yeah, you're getting at it, but I mean that's right. I mean, easy examples. New York has the cities of New York have a lot of direct authority over how broadband is deployed. So New York City, for example, decides how Verizon Fios is deployed and has to negotiate with Verizon directly. Whereas in California, most of it's done at the regulator level. So it's a statewide license. It's mostly guided by the governor and the legislature rather than individual cities. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, just to kind of complete the circle on the history there, a lot of that stems from the failure to pass the 2006 rewrite, the COPE Act, because of the original plan. Verizon wanted a kind of new set of rules for deploying fiber and Fios, and wanted to kind of preempt a lot of the state rules in this space, unify it all with one federal structure. Failed to do that, and then had to go to all 50 states one by one to kind of modernize and change rights of way rules.
Right. No, absolutely. Great point about the upshot of that failed effort 23 years ago. So, sorry, not that long ago, 13 years ago, right?
Yeah.
My math wrong. 17 years ago.
Internet speeds fast. Yeah.
Somewhere in that process. So Ernesto, we definitely want to get to broadband policy, and particularly some of the things that have happened in California in the lead up to the pandemic and subsequent to the pandemic. But we want to make sure, please give us your questions, both on the page or the chat. I can see this chat questions. Try to get these in. This is a great question and I want to preface this by saying I was just a few blocks over at the U.S. Conference of Mayors conference this week and today. And Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, the agency that supervises the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which of course is responsible for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money that we all in this community care so much about. Gina Raimondo really emphasized affordability, affordable. I heard her say that 3 or 4 times. And so this question that my colleague Sarah Lai Sterland asks. Hi, Ernesto. What does the future of affordable access to broadband look like in California, in your opinion? And will it look different from the rest of the United States? So let's kind of talk about California as an example, if you will, of how we get at affordability in broadband.
Yeah, and definitely take the state of California as a kind of a unique example amongst the states. We are the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world, right? Our budget is enormous. The economy is enormous. But at the same time, the needs are enormous. California's infrastructure law, which I was very involved in its original drafting and kind of the work around it. It's called SB 156. Governor Newsom signed it in 2021, early 2021, and it's a product of maybe 2 years of debate, starting in early 2020. And the original intention behind it has always been, how do we get fiber to the home to everyone, or at least virtually everyone, right? There's always like a fraction of that 1% that's going to be like so far out there you can't figure it out. And I will grant that to folks. Most policy, the reality is we're not really even near that issue yet. We're like 60% away from that issue. And EFF in late 2019, kind of declared that there's a real crisis in kind of 21st century access in the United States, meaning the lack of fiber infrastructure being deployed. It's hard to kind of think, it's not that long ago, but when you compare the United States to most other countries of equivalent economic power, I would say, most other countries are like double the number of people connected to fiber than the United States. And in terms of direct international competitors, in China, they were outbuilding us like 8 to 9 times, the difference in terms of every year of fiber deployment. So, we originally were looking at it from a, who's the direct competitor to your cable monopoly? It's a fiber provider. And the lack of a direct competitor in lots of places across the country is a problem. And upon further digging, the technical side of it was pretty clear. The future-proof infrastructure is a transmission medium, meaning the thing to move data through could be the air, in terms of wireless, or in this instance, the wire. Is it copper? Is it coaxial cable? Is it fiber? There was no question from an engineering standpoint that fiber carries enormous potential that just can't be matched by anything else in the wireline space. So we started looking into policy to figure out what are these other countries doing right, because they're clearly nearly double the deployment numbers than we are. What are the differences between the United States and them in terms of our history in the telecom space? Because it's actually very relevant as to why it's different here, or why we are where we are. And and then just what were all the mistakes we made in the past, and how do we not repeat those? Mm-hmm. And one of the big ones that I felt very confident after a lot of research was just the the metrics we established for minimum speeds for subsidies was really damaging to our efforts. Interesting.
So you're talking about like that 10-1 standard, 10
yes,
down 1 megabit up for an early round.
4.1, yes, 4.1. Then it was 10.1. Then it became 25.3, and it's still 25.3. Crazy enough today. It's changed because the reality. I think Congress overtook reality with the new infrastructure law, but the FCC still hasn't updated its kind of metrics here. But yeah, it boils down to when you tell people lowest common denominator, it's more important to just get people anything at whatever whatever you're doing at this price point, or at this minimum speed. Most of that money ended up going into copper networks with AT&T and Frontier. You think about the billions upon billions upon billions that went into that, and with the exception of one state in the United States, which is North Dakota. North Dakota has no major ILEC there. North Dakota Internet Access is mostly small carriers, public and private, and their emphasis when they were receiving subsidies was fiber. And so if you took North Dakota as its own country, they are probably one of the most fibered up places in the world. Wow. Which is crazy to think about, of a 600,000 population rural state. But it's because every dollar they spent was on fiber, and incrementally they kept building up on that foundation. Whereas in the other states where we spent a lot of money on DSL and copper to subsidize and plus up DSL to 10.1, frankly, all that money's gone. They've wasted now, because that infrastructure doesn't serve anyone's needs at this point. Demand has far surpassed the capacity of those networks. AT&T is looking to try and just get rid of its copper network as best it can, through copper retirement. And the speed that you set is kind of the policy. And
Right.
so that's where the debate around 100 symmetrical, which we advocated for, versus 100 down, 20 up, which was coincidentally the speed that T-Mobile can do with fixed wireless, and AT&T can do with fixed wireless. These speeds are about choices in what you're subsidizing. And from our perspective, for every dollar that went towards fiber is a dollar you don't have to come back to spend any time in the near future. Whereas history shows all the dollars we spent, almost the equivalent of what we're spending in the infrastructure dollars, 100+ billion historically, did not yield us a future-proof infrastructure.
So let's hold on to
So,
the. Sorry.
well, I'm sorry, because
Yeah.
so that was a real long story to get to the California situation, because that we're in California, we're very involved in the broadband policy. This is what we're explaining to the governor and the
Got it.
legislature,
Got it.
and the pandemic hits. So in early 2020, we introduced a bill with Senator Lena Gonzalez from the LA County area, to basically establish a fiber standard for subsidies going forward, to begin that debate. And then 2 months later, the pandemic hits, like full on. Buildings are shutting down, schools are closing. So the political priority of figuring out the broadband question exploded. And the following year, the state of California had a surplus of somewhere in the vicinity, I think, $65 billion. So suddenly it's like the right ideas are there, the money's there, and the rationale as to what we need to do to solve this emergency situation for the long run was all there. So Governor Newsom put together a package that kind of took from the original draft proposals from the previous year. And California is, for the most part, is going to have an enormous amount of public infrastructure and private infrastructure that's fiber based and fiber focused. And to the answer, finally bring it back to the answer of the affordability question, I think that means the future of access in California, because there's $6 billion being invested plus another $6 to $7 billion in long-term financing, which was calculated to be enough to get everyone fiber to the home pretty much, is bright, because that infrastructure is pretty much set to have ever increasing speeds with lowering prices with advances in hardware. So I feel really good. As long as we keep the eye on the ball and the emphasis and the focus of what we're building with this dollars, there, I do think California broadband prices are going to go down while speeds are going to go exponentially higher.
So it's wait, speeds down and prices
No, no.
higher, or the reverse?
Exponentially, speeds are going to keep continuing to increase, and
Got
then
it.
prices are going to go down.
Price going to go. Good Lord. So it sounds, what I'm hearing, Ernesto, is like a two-part argument. Like the first part is, what's the technology used, and the answer you're saying is fiber, and it's pretty clear. And then the second one is, well, then how do we get the best bang for our buck with fiber? And this sort of leads into a question Ashley Polling, I'm not sure I say it, says, Ernesto, can you tell us what you think will finally shift the U.S. market from single network dominance to shared or wholesale networks? So talk a little bit about your thoughts on open access wholesale networks, and why that's important, particularly in the light of the fiber point you just made.
Yeah. So so one of the things I've been looking into a lot, particularly in the European side of why they have so much more fiber in certain members of the European Union than us. There's a whole industry of what are called open access providers, companies that build the fiber lines, don't sell broadband. They just build the wires, and then they lease the access to the wires to as many comers as who would like to come in. And that what's called structural separation, the lack of incentive for them to be the broadband provider directly, is critical, because they're just interested in aggregating demand, meaning aggregating all the possible users onto the network. And because they have an enormous amount of capacity in the wires, they can just slap on as many people as possible to increase their revenues. So there's an open access fiber industry that's fairly vibrant and robust and growing in the European space, and not so much in the United States at this time. And so the reality of the efficiency of that model was not lost on us. And when California passed its infrastructure law, a lot of our emphasis was on, it's time to think about the infrastructure as a shared resource, kind of like how it was in the 90s, ironically enough. Because the capacity is there, all these different needs beyond just broadband. Public safety has needs, electricity, the utility industry has needs. kind of scientists have interesting needs of this infrastructure. There's all sorts of different ways fiber infrastructure can be used that is not just moving data for broadband purposes. That you need a way for everyone to be able to access it, and it has to be done in a way that is equitable, but also sustainable in terms of like the revenues to pay for the infrastructure. I think there was this interesting study that was done in the EU that talked about kind of if you had government subsidies to pay for the infrastructure, how much further could it stretch if the emphasis was on open access infrastructure, meaning infrastructure was able to be used by multiple different players, multiple different users, multiple different competitors, versus just subsidizing an AT&T equivalent. And their numbers on kind of risk assessment, possible revenue generation, efficiencies of shared use was really compelling, and demonstrated you can get a lot further with the exact same amount of government investment with open access fiber than you could with just a direct vertically integrated broadband provider. And EFF received a grant to kind of study this question further right after the California law passed, because there was a real interest in the California legislature, the governor's office, as well as the county governments in the rural side of California to explore open access fiber. And so, as well as in major cities like Los Angeles County. So we basically did a cost model study, and it's on the EFF website. If you just Google like EFF open access fiber study, you'll find it.
It's also linked to in the article.
Oh, great, perfect.
Here, Ernesto.
Yeah, but we tested the results with the cost model data that exists in California, which is very detailed and robust, and the same results. It shows you can get in the like Los Angeles County area, you can deploy at an economically feasible, commercial, unsubsidized basis open access fiber to more than 90% of the population of the county and 10 million people, and before you even need to think about any subsidization, which is like way bigger and way more efficient than just directly subsidizing existing carriers to just kind of build more. So yeah, it is there's expected to be 3 or 4 projects that are going to get launched that are open access based, pure open access based by the county governments in California, relying on the new infrastructure law. And I suspect those will catch fire and kind of spread pretty quickly.
So what is the California infrastructure law, which I guess you point out was passed, either fall of 2020 or early 2021, right? I mean, it was before the IIJA in November 2021, correct?
Yeah, it was. I'm looking at the days. It was signed into law in July 2021.
Okay, so what does that law do, both in terms of money for California and in terms of policy and incentives, particularly for open access wholesale networks like we've just been talking about for a few minutes?
Yeah. So, there's there's a number of prongs in the California law. So there's kind of the traditional last mile grants, about $2 billion in grants for last mile applications. Those are pretty standard in terms of what you would expect. They're targeted towards the unserved areas, a little bit in terms of underserved, and so that's like kind of the traditional prong. The more innovative new things that were coming was the one I'm most proud of is what's called the Loan Loss Reserve Program. So this is essentially a long-term financing vehicle. So think of like how the Rural Utilities Service got electricity far out into rural areas. They basically gave very cheap loans, 40-year loans to cooperatives and utilities to build out there. The Department of Agriculture is always proud to say no one's ever defaulted on that, and it makes sense because everyone needed electricity. Everyone was going to pay for electricity. No one was going to say, I'm just going to not need electricity for a few months, and forego it. Right? It's a utility. It's a demand. So consistent demand makes these really long-term financial vehicles viable, and with fiber in particular, the longevity of the wire, as long as you build it right in terms of like natural disaster preparedness and things like that, is expected to be many decades. It's expected to deliver broadband speeds that are capable of meeting today's needs and future needs for many decades on out. We actually don't even know kind of the full length. I've heard 50 years. I've even heard potentially up to 70 years. So it's as an asset, it's well suited for something that's like a 40-year loan to pay it off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and so this loan loss reserve program is explicitly designed around county governments, school districts, tribes, nonprofits, and kind of a whole host of entities that are essentially just the non-traditional carriers to be the applicants of these loans. And California is kind of unique in this space because people would say, well, why don't they just apply for like a rural utility service loan, and from there. The problem is we as a state, because of our population and the way it's distributed, we don't really qualify as rural in the same way as like a southern or Midwestern state does. We have large population centers that are too close to the far off distant farmland territory, and so because of the proximity, they get treated as both urban, which is just not true. But we needed a means of accessing long-term financing that allowed us to do this. So that's the big second piece. And then there's a lot of technical assistance money, meaning the state will help communities or local providers or local, kind of small players manage the grant process, develop feasibility studies, a lot of kind of partnership work from the state government with local players to come up with their own solutions here. And the last piece is the middle mile infrastructure. So the state of California itself is building an open access middle mile infrastructure. Is about $2.5 billion set aside for that. And the intention is to bring the fiber as close as you can to all these communities who
Right.
plan to apply for those last mile grants and the loan loss reserve long-term financing funds.
Compare 2.5 billion, right? I got the right. It's B,
Yep.
2.5 billion for a middle mile in just California versus 1 billion for the whole United States
Yes.
in the middle mile program that's part of IIJA. Obviously, one could argue, well, middle mile was the whole point of the BTOP round 10 or so years ago. And there's some truth to that, but there's a real need for better middle mile access. We got more questions here. Let's make sure to get one. This is from David Tate, who asks this question every time. What are your thoughts about network latency under load and providing better quality of experience, quality of service, better video conferencing, as well as the IPv6, the Internet Protocol version 6, as part of this upgrade? What are your thoughts on this question of network latency, Ernesto?
Yeah, I think that's like kind of the next generation of issues we need to start thinking about, particularly as the I think it's oversimplified when we think about broadband speed is like the thing we have to figure out, like if it's gigabits, how many gigabits, and that's like the thing that addresses just the efficiency of the technology and how best to use it. There's multiple layers to it. I think latency in particular is undervalued in policy. We don't actually even assess latency at all, really, in terms of when you think about when the FCC maps out where is access, there really isn't any sort of overlaying data about what is the latency of these access points in this community.
Mm-hmm.
We just have ISP self-report. Do you offer 25/3? Do you offer 100 down, 20 up? Do you offer 500 and 100? And I think we need to pivot from that. I think we need to start looking at low latency, as low latency as possible. I do. The FCC does issue kind of broad, generalized studies about different technologies and their performance on latency. But I think when particularly if virtual reality really takes off beyond kind of the discrete market that exists now to a more ubiquitous part of the economy, instantaneous communication and near instantaneous communication is going to be key. And you can have a very fat pipe, if you will, in terms of your broadband speeds, but if of all the other properties that are necessary to make that connection clean, if you will, are not there, then you don't have good service. It really won't matter how many gigabits per second you may have. So I definitely think it's a area policy needs to shift. I also think the FCC and state regulators need to also think about future trajectory of capacity. There's language in that in the IIJA about future proofing in the sense of able to evolve to meet future needs. But I think the government could be more proactive in actually predicting what those future needs would likely be, and then assessing the existing infrastructure to see, is this community ready for the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Right.
We do that for lots of things. We do that for fuel consumption. We do that for kind of electricity needs, but we don't really do that for broadband right now.
Mm-hmm. We've got a number of questions about privacy, right? And this is certainly an issue that EFF has worked on for years, particularly privacy vis-a-vis the government, but now there's a lot of attention on privacy vis-a-vis tech companies. Keely Knight asks, Mr. Falcon, how do you envision the intersection of technology and privacy evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
So right now, as a policy matter, it's mostly driven by the states in terms of like your rights to privacy and how that works. Illinois has probably one of the strongest privacy laws on the books. It's a Biometric Information Protection Act, BIPA for short. Basically, if a company were to scan biometric information like your irises, your fingerprints, things like that, without your permission, you can sue them. And it's the only state in the country that has that law. And so, EFF's very familiar with it because we've had to sue companies that kind of do really kind of creepy, egregious, like mass-wide scanning of faces and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And but we only have Illinois as the lever. I think if you really want to change privacy in the technology space, you have to empower consumers to have a lot more direct control and power over what happens with their information. We have that very much in kind of this mishmash patchwork of a few states have a few laws that we can rely on as a consumer protection privacy organization, but ultimately we need to really get it to a point where your personal information is treated as something that you carries a set of legal rights to you, and companies have to respect those when they design their products, so as a means to avoid liability. The lack of being able to sue a company directly is really, I think, the core problem.
Do you kind of lobby or work on the privacy issue? Do you have other folks at EFF that are focused on that?
I work on it. A handful of us work on it because it's such a big issue. I'd say about 5 or 6 people at EFF in different venues work on the issue of privacy, in terms of consumer privacy, and then there's an even larger number of people who work on kind of government surveillance, Fourth Amendment privacy.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty involved in a lot of the debates that are happening kind of in both in DC and the Sacramento.
Was EFF supportive of this 2022 federal privacy bill that seemed to get a lot of steam, bipartisan, but there were a lot of California representatives who objected to it on the grounds that it would preempt California's privacy law? Just a brief minute on that, Ernesto, if you've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think the industry that wants a federal law have yet to come to terms that you can't reduce overall privacy that exists in the handful of state laws and get a federal law in exchange for that. Because what they ask for is what's called preemption. They want all state laws to be kind of blocked and like kind of null and void in exchange for this new federal law. But then they ask for a weaker federal law on top of that. So, you can't have both. If there was a political calculus or the political way to get it done at the end of the day is the federal law would be superior to all the state laws as the bargain for no more new state laws coming forward. Mm-hmm. But we're not there yet, I think, in the debate.
We have a question from Will D. What are your views on government regulation of financial currency as the world begins moving toward not just non-fiat digital cryptocurrencies, but also experiments with digital representatives of state-issued fiat currency, or stable coins, as they're called? What are your thoughts on that, Ernesto?
So, EFF's focus in that space really is just on the privacy aspect. I think people, kind of a founding principle of the Electronic Frontier Foundation is, we started a little over 30 years ago, is as technology evolves, that your rights, that your traditional, rights to speech, privacy, your civil liberties, they remain the same or they're enhanced. Before kind of the digitization of money, we use credit cards for lots of things. We use our phones now for lots of things. When we usually have to do mostly cash, that was private, right? Like you can pay for something with some cash in a store, and no one would know where you were, no one would know what you bought, no one had a right to know that. And we're losing that. We're losing that rapidly with kind of everything becoming a digital, purchase in terms of like your credit cards and your phones. people have a laundry list of like where you've been, when you've been there, what you bought, and who's buying it, right? So to the extent the cryptocurrency and kind of the alternative currencies that are designed around keeping your information private is interesting to us because it's akin to cash. Bringing it back to the the philosophy, when we had cash as the main way we bought things, you had privacy in terms of what you purchased, and no one had a right to know what you were buying, and the government is not entitled to know that, and this may be a way to get us back to that. So to that extent, as a policy matter, we're supportive of figuring out how to bring privacy back to digital transactions.
This is going to date myself, Ernesto, but I was there when Scott McNeely, formerly of Sun Microsystems, said, "You have no privacy. Get over it." Right? I mean, I heard him say those words out of my mouth, and that was before before the year 2000, right?
Right.
And so here we are, 20 some years later. You have no privacy. Get over it. Is that a true statement, or is that not a true statement? Can we truly get the genie back in the bottle on this digital tracking that is inevitable when you can, see where your currencies went, or where your mouse clicks went, or as we get into the metaverse, where your haptic interactions go,
where your eyes are going? Yeah.
Right.
It's all, but at the end of the day, much like the internet itself and the telecom market and the broadband access market, we're all dependent on the rules and regulations that establish those markets, kind of establish kind of the parameters of competition and what they can and can't do.
Right.
We should try regulation first. We don't really regulate to any great extent the commercial market of exchanging our personal information.
Mm-hmm.
Were we to do that and it still doesn't work, then we can have that discussion. But I think a lot of people don't realize how underregulated the space is, or in some instances unregulated. And I do believe that liability plays an enormous role in product design, corporate counsel guidance to executives about what we should and shouldn't do with the next big thing we want to try and launch. And the absence of that, the absence of a private right of action and privacy generally, allows them to really push the envelope, because the consequences of the the Equifax or the I forget the one with Facebook, off the top of my head in terms of the campaign stuff.
Right.
But the consequence of the next as Cindy Cohen likes to call it, the data Valdez, the giant oil spill of our
Mm-hmm.
personal information being released from a giant breach, is minimal. No one pays a huge price for that kind of stuff.
We have a question live from the chat stream from Robert Martin. Ernesto, thank you for your time today. The FCC is escalating its language around unlicensed use of the broadband serviceable location fabric, right? This is an issue we've focused on a lot here at Broadband.money, also Broadband Breakfast, and yet this downloading address level data from the National Broadband Map is potentially an infringement, it's been called. Can those entities that would want to attack downloading data, can they legitimately invoke the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act against not-for-profit actors such as researchers and community advocates? Any thoughts on that, Ernesto?
So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is an overly broad law that is misapplied regularly. I'd have to look at the specifics of what's being asked here, because I don't know it,
Right.
but I wouldn't be surprised. A law that has been used, weaponized, in lots of ways that really had anything to do with the intent of the law, could be weaponized in a way that suppresses honest critique and research. Doesn't surprise us. If the EFF has had to represent many people who are fearful of CFA liability, and to the extent that anyone is concerned about that, they should email info@eff.org with their concerns, and we'd be happy to take a look. But I do think it is important that access to information, people being able to kind of critique and research stuff is hypercritical, particularly now with the amount of money being attached to the fabric and the FCC maps.
Well, and the role, of course, of making sure that we EFF has been such an important resource for people who are kind of attacked. I mean, I think, in fact, the origins of EFF, if I remember correctly, go back to some of the privacy attacks on Stephen Jackson Games and some other players and actors who were really, you know, threatened with prosecution. And so EFF is kind of got a very public interest law component to it, in addition to being the policy arm that you are.
Ernesto, we're a mix of, you know, kind of three groups where there's engineers at EFF, there's lawyers, and there's activists. And that's definitely the province of the lawyers, and they'd be happy to look at stuff for folks if people are worried about that.
I want to ask you a question about AI, and I don't know if you saw the questions on the page, Ernesto, but I put in about 6 questions that had been generated by an input into, you know, Chat GPT, right? And it was like, questions to ask Ernesto Falcon of the electric, and these are decent questions, right? I mean, these are all, they're all labeled with Broadband Breakfast, just for the readers to be able to see, like, how does EFF work with lawmakers and policymakers to shape legislation and regulations relating to technology and civil liberties? How does the EFF go about balancing the competing interests of protecting individual rights and promoting innovation? I mean, they're all maybe pedestrian, but they're all questions, and they're all generated by a computer. And so what are your thoughts about AI and the policy issues that we either will run into or already have run into and we're not doing anything about with regards to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I there's a couple of policy issues in the AI space I can you know, or things that would fall into the EFF umbrella of looking at and trying to figure out what the right solution is. You know, I think, you know, we're always going to be pro innovation in terms of like advanced technology. If it could advance, you know, society and people's ability to you know, do things in easier ways, access to information, and but there are, you know, are challenges I don't think we have contemplated, or not, or ill suited for. So one example in kind of the more you know, law enforcement context, there's starting to be a little deference to AI in the kind of judicial decision making space, or relying on kind of automated means of assessing the possibility of someone, you know, re-engaging in crime, which then affects like their punishment or parole, or you know, AI that studies kind of activity in a city and then suggest this is where police resources should be deployed in order to properly respond to what the AI is projecting as possibilities, right, based on the parameters. The problem is enormous amount of this information is tinged with you know, racism. I mean, in a way that, yeah, and Peter Eckersley, who used to be our chief technologist, you know, he said it really well to us, is if the data is tainted, there is nothing the AI system can do to wash away the taint. And so if you know, so to give like the distribution of police resources example, if the community is already over policed, the data coming to the aggregation of the system will be overrepresented for that area, simply because the mistakes were already made on the front end. And then naturally the system will overpredict certain areas are over policed as areas you need to deploy even more resources, because it'll say, well, there's obviously a lot of things happening here, therefore more needs to be deployed in that area, which in many cases is probably the opposite of what needs to happen. And you know, so like that's a big challenge in AI, in that I think there's a willingness to believe if computers made the decision, it must be scrubbed of human bias. That's not true. It's just, and it'll never be true. So we always have to be vigilant about what's the data going in. And then in another really interesting, more cheerful context, you know, artificial intelligence is being used to kind of do a lot of neat things with art. People are able to like kind of go on different programs and type in like a handful of words, and it generates like a piece of art, you know, like pirate cats and things like that. But the future, what that could be, is really interesting. And then we run into copyright. And you know, if I typed in something in, or if I created a art generation artificial intelligence, you know, system, and it created something that was an infringing work, am I liable for that? And possibly, right? And so like that, and that's a real big problem for something that could be, used across the world quickly a billion times over. Like you think about like, oh well, if I only have a 0.0001% chance to be in trouble, well, you multiply that enough across the world, then you're going to get in trouble.
Right.
So
Statutory
that,
damages does a lot of damage in copyright.
yeah,
Right. Ernesto, I want to come back to open access here, maybe as our last substantive topic here. Jim Hanley comes in with a great question right now here, but let's pivot off this to other aspects of open access. Jim asks, what do you think of the recent AT&T Blackstone or Gigapower announcement to build open access fiber infrastructure outside of current AT&T landline territory? Do you know much about Gigapower? What is it?
yeah. Not in enormous detail because I don't think a lot of detail is out yet, but I know enough to think like to kind of have the interesting questions off the bat. I do think the purchase and then removal of HBO from AT&T has changed like their emphasis of what they're doing as a company, and I think the emphasis now is like figuring out how to get more fiber to more places. Frontier Communications went through that evolution when they went bankrupt. Because they had to look at their copper infrastructure and say, like, this is making us money, it's costing us more, and we're losing customers left and right. What's the future? Well, we've got to replace as many of these lines with fiber to the home. And they found that if they stretched out their investment window, meaning the return on investment window, meaning if they planned out, 10 years from now we'll make our money back from the investment, and then years on out we'll make more. How many more homes are viable under that model? And so around 3 million in their network. So I think AT&T's gone through this stage to think about how do we push fiber in more places, and shared uses is I think the next step. The idea of like, well, we don't actually have to own and run the entire thing ourselves, we just need it accessible for our purpose, and we're willing to go with other players who need it for their purposes, for whatever they're doing. Now the question is, I think open access to really work, the entity who decides who gets on that network has to be structurally separated from selling broadband. So I think because there's just a clear conflict of interest. I'm not going to make it so that you can undersell me or take my customers and my revenue. And I think that is the things I don't know about this arrangement that AT&T struck with, with that group, is to who is making those decisions in terms of who gets on the network, and how much is the direct competitive considerations that AT&T has as the first provider there. How much power do they have over deciding who else gets on it?
Let's go back to that study that you at EFF supported by diffraction analysis. Wholesale fiber is the key to broad U.S. FTTP or fiber to the premise coverage, and basically this is the one that came to the conclusion that a wholesale network operator could cover close to 80% of U.S. households, and you said 90% in some areas like L.A. County, with fiber to the premises, whereas a vertically integrated operator model, the traditional model, the Verizon model, the AT&T model, the Comcast model, could only reach 50% profitably. What kind of drives that? What makes open access more affordable vis-a-vis the vertically integrated alternative?
Yeah, I think in the most simple way to think about it is revenue potential. How many how many users of that infrastructure can they get? Because each new user is a source of revenue, and the structurally separated open access provider has no beef with anyone, right? Like they just want to get people to lease access to the infrastructure and make it accessible to them. So if 5 broadband companies wanted to come to them and lease access, they will sign all 5 of them up. But the vertical player can't do that, right? It would cannibalize their last mile sales, and so they're not interested in tapping into that potential. And that's where the biggest limiting factor is. There are so many different needs for that infrastructure that can all be aggregated by one player, and that player has to be willing to offer it to all players. And the vertically integrated player has direct competitive considerations when it comes to horizontal markets.
Well, Ernesto, it's been wonderful. The hour's flown by. I've got a final question. It's actually a 2-part question. I want to ask about 2 people and whether you can share any fascinating or interesting stories. One very much kind of out there, alive and kicking. That's Gigi Sohn. You've worked with her. Obviously, she's been in this limbo position for more than a year, I think. And it's, what are your thoughts on her confirmation to get a 5-member Federal Communications Commission? That's one person. And then, do you have any stories about some of those founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, such as John Perry Barlow, who passed on about 4 years ago? I knew him. I assume you interacted with him a little bit. Tell us a little bit about Gigi and about John Perry Barlow.
Yeah, so I do think Gigi's own will be confirmed. Will be confirmed. I think a whole mess of the procedural hurdles in terms of delays that were kind of designed into the 50-50 Senate, the Senate of equal sharing of power. The fact that they're gone is going to make a lot more nominations move to confirmation much quicker. It's worth noting there's more than 100 nominees from the Biden administration that never got a vote in the Senate.
Wow.
So she's just one of a lot of backlog, and that backlog is going to clear. I think Senate Democrats are pretty clear they're going to be moving the president's nominees quickly. I'd expect her to get confirmed in the next couple months. The Senate is in session in a few days. They'll start beginning their process of moving nominees through February and March. That's kind of the first tranche, and I expect her to be in that.
That's great. It's very heartening news. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah. John Perry Barlow. Yeah. I mean, I got to meet him a couple times early in my time at EFF. I mean, really kind of the word poet, comes to mind when I remember my interactions with him, and it's always kind of a special. There's a specialness to him in and I think amongst many internet advocates with his Declaration of Rights, and I remember going to that he's got it on YouTube and himself recording it and doing it, which is great. But a lot of fond memories about kind of how he set forth, I think, a philosophy and a vision about where the internet should go.
Well, thank you for those reflections and projections. Just before we go, we want to remind you that 2 weeks from now, on February 3rd, we'll have an Ask Me Anything with Catherine DeWitt, Project Director for Broadband Access at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And 2 weeks after that, we're going to welcome Jade Piros de Carvalho, Director of the Kansas Office of Broadband Development and a mayor from the Kansas City area. On behalf of the Broadband Grants community and Ernesto Falcon, I'm Drew Clark, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for having me.